Hello everyone and welcome to the biology lecture series, and today we are going to discuss the topic human reproduction. So this lecture is the continuation of the previous lecture. So what we have discussed in the previous lecture, we have discussed about the male and the female reproductive system. Okay, and then we also talked about the gametogenesis. What is gametogenesis? Gametogenesis is the formation of the gametes. Okay, male gamete is known as the sperm and female gamete is known as the ovum or the egg. Okay, then we talked about the various stages of gametogenesis in males and the females. So, gametogenesis in males is known as spermatogenesis and the gametogenesis in female is known as oogenesis. Alright, so what we are going to study in this lecture, we are going to study about the menstrual cycle in this lecture. Alright, we'll talk about the stages that are involved in the menstrual cycle. Okay, we will study them individually in detail. Okay, so now first let me introduce you to this menstrual cycle. What is menstrual cycle? Let's have a look at the definition. So the reproductive cycle in the female primates. So menstrual cycle takes place in the female. Okay, that too in the primates. So the reproductive cycle in female primates such as monkeys, okay, apes, human beings. You must have seen in the female human being, you must be knowing about the menstrual cycle. So the reproductive cycle in the female primates, this is known as the menstrual cycle. So this is a simple definition. Okay. What is the detailed definition? The menstrual cycle is a natural process that occurs in the female of reproductive age, typically lasting for 28 days. Means the menstrual cycle typically lasts for 28 days. It can vary also, but the average is around 28 days. Okay, so although it can vary. So what does this mean? Let's understand this. So it occurs in the female of reproductive age. Means menstrual cycle starts after the female individual, it achieves the puberty. So after puberty, the menstruation cycle starts, or when the female attains the reproductive stage. Alright, the first is the adolescent stage and second one is the reproductive stage. So if we talk about the life stages or life cycle, suppose we are talking about humans. So first is the adolescent stage. First is the adolescence. Second is the reproductive phase. Reproductive phase, or you can say reproductive stage. So what happens? Reproductive stage is attained after attaining the puberty. So you can write in the bracket, reproductive stage is attained after the female individual achieves or attains the puberty. You can write after attaining puberty. So what happens at puberty? The primary sex organs, which are ovaries in females, they become active and they start secreting the hormones, as well as they also start the process of gametogenesis. Means they start forming the ovum. Clear? So you can write what is happening at the puberty. So first of all, there is a lot of physical and hormonal changes. There is physical and hormonal changes that occurs at the puberty. And what happens? The primary sex organ in females, this is the ovaries. So ovaries, they start secreting the hormones. What is the function of primary sex organs? Okay, you can write like this. they start secreting the hormones such as estrogen and progesterone. Such as estrogen and progesterone. And what else they are doing? So this is the first function. Second is the formation of the female gamete. Okay, formation of the female gamete, which is known as the ovum or the egg. Okay, this is clear. Then, so this menstrual cycle, it involves a series of hormonal changes which occurs at the puberty and the physiological changes that prepare the body for possible pregnancy. Clear? So there are a lot of hormonal changes. There is secretion of the hormones and there are a lot of physiological changes also. We've already discussed the primary follicle. It gets converted into secondary follicle and then tertiary follicle. And finally, tertiary follicle matures into the Graafian follicle. Clear? Now, the first menstruation begins at the puberty and it is known as the menarche. Okay, so this is the term given to the first menstruation that begins at the puberty. This is known as the menarche. So you should remember this. So how can you define menarche? The first menstruation which begins at the puberty, this is known as the menarche. Now in human females, menstruation is repeated at an average interval of about 28 to 29 days, although it can vary. And the cycle of events starting from one menstruation till the next one, this is known as the menstrual cycle. Okay, so you can define menstrual cycle like this also. The cycle of events starting from one menstruation till the next one, this is known as menstruation cycle. Then you can add there are a lot of hormonal and physiological changes. Okay, and menstruation occurs when the female attains the reproductive age. Clear? And what happens during menstruation? During menstrual cycle, one ovum, which is known as the egg, is released during the middle of the each menstrual cycle. This release of the ovum, this is known as the ovulation. So during the ovulation, there is the release of the ovum. Clear? And it happens during the middle of the menstrual cycle. So menstrual cycle, if it is around 28 days, then the middle of the menstrual cycle will be around 14 days. Clear? Now let's move on to the next slide. Now let's talk about the major events which are happening during the menstrual cycle, including the uterine events. So we are focusing on the uterine events. What is happening to the uterine wall during the menstrual cycle? So you must be knowing about the endometrium. Endometrium is the innermost wall of the uterus. So first stage is the menstruation, also known as the bleeding stage. Okay, it's also known as the bleeding stage. So what happens? As the name suggests, there is the bleeding due to the shedding of the endometrium. Clear? So what happens during menstruation? So this phase lasts for 1 to 5 days and there is a shedding of the uterine lining. So there is a shedding of the endometrium and the blood is released through the vagina. So endometrium along with the blood vessels, it breaks down and there is the release of the blood through the vagina. This is known as menstruation. Now, why this menstruation occurs? If there is a lack of fertilization. If the fertilization doesn't occur in the previous cycle, then the endometrium, it becomes very thin and it sheds down, it breaks down and it releases blood through the vagina. Alright, this is clear. So endometrium is thinnest during the bleeding phase. You can write here, endometrium is thinnest. Thinnest endometrium during the bleeding phase or the menstrual phase. And this is because there is the decrease in the level of the hormones, estrogen and the progesterone. So there is a decrease in the level of the hormones, and these hormones are required for the maintenance of the endometrium. Clear? So why the endometrium become thin? Because there is the decrease in the level of the hormones. Okay, both estrogen and progesterone. Which hormones? Estrogen as well as progesterone. So both these hormones are required for maintenance of the endometrium. Clear? Now, next phase is the proliferative phase, also known as the follicular phase. Okay, this is also known as the follicular phase. So what happens during the follicular phase? The estrogen level rises here, stimulating the thickening of the endometrial lining. So we are focusing on the uterine events. So we are focusing on the endometrium. So here what happens? There is the increase in the level of the estrogen, and estrogen, it helps to maintain the endometrium. So as the level of the estrogen rises, the endometrium lining, this also thickens. Okay, so endometrium will become thick during this proliferative phase. It will start becoming thick. There will be the growth of the endometrium cells. Okay, and what happens during this follicular phase? There is the maturation of the follicle. So primary follicle, finally it transforms into the mature follicle. Alright, so what is happening during this phase? The primary follicle, it finally matures into or transforms into the mature follicle. So what happens? Primary follicle, it gets transformed into secondary follicle. Secondary follicle gets transformed into the tertiary follicle, and tertiary follicle finally transformed into the mature follicle, which is known as the Graafian follicle. So this is known as the Graafian follicle. Clear? And these follicles, they secrete this hormone estrogen. Alright? So what happens? Because of the increase in the level of the estrogen, the endometrium becomes rich in the blood vessels as well as the glands, preparing for potential implantation of the fertilized egg. Okay? So why is endometrium becoming thick? Because it is preparing for the potential implantation of the fertilized egg. What happens during the implantation? The blastocyst, it gets attached to the uterine wall. We'll study about this also. Okay? We'll study about the fertilization and implantation. Now let's study about the major events of the menstrual cycle. Again, during the uterine wall, we are continuing this. So next phase is the ovulation phase. Okay, so what happens during the ovulation? There is the release of the ovum, and it takes place during the mid of the menstruation cycle, which is around 14 days. Alright, so there is a surge in the LH hormone, luteinizing hormone. This is known as the LH surge. This is known as the LH surge, and LH, this is involved in the release of the mature egg, which is known as the oocyte from the ovary. So the ovulation occurs because of the LH surge. Clear? And what happens here? The endometrium is at its most receptive stage for the potential implantation of the fertilized egg. Clear? So during ovulation, there is the release of the ovum. Now next is the luteal phase. Clear? So during luteal phase, what happens? We were talking about the Graafian follicle. So this Graafian follicle, it contains this ovum. And the Graafian follicle, it disintegrate. It breaks down and it releases the ovum, and whatever left is transformed into the corpus luteum. Clear? So what happens? The primary follicle it transforms into the secondary follicle. Secondary follicle get transformed into the tertiary follicle. Tertiary follicle finally matures into the Graafian follicle. And the Graafian follicle then ruptures. Graafian follicle ruptures and releases the ovum. And this is known as the ovulation. So release of ovum takes place during the ovulation. Then what happens? The remaining structure after the rupture of the ovum. So the remaining structure, okay, which is left, gets transformed into the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. Okay, so next phase is after ovulation is the luteal phase, in which what happens? There is the formation of the corpus luteum. Clear? Now what happens after ovulation? The empty follicle or the ruptured Graafian follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and corpus luteum is it is known as the temporary endocrine gland. Okay, corpus luteum is it is called as a temporary endocrine gland. What is the function of the endocrine gland? They secrete the hormones. Clear? So what hormones do they secrete? They secrete progesterone. So the level of progesterone will be very high during the luteal phase. So corpus luteum, it secretes high amount of progesterone, and it also secretes some estrogen. Now, what is the role of the progesterone? Progesterone also helps to maintain the endometrial lining. So it maintains the thickened endometrial lining, preparing for again possible implantation. Clear? So you can say the endometrium is thickest during the luteal phase. So the endometrium, it is thickest during the luteal phase. Why it is thickest? Because there is a very high level of progesterone here, and progesterone helps to maintain the thickening of the endometrium lining. Now, if no fertilization occurs, means if there is no fusion of the male and the female gametes, then what happens? The corpus luteum will degenerate, leading to the drop in the hormone levels. And the next cycle will start now. So again, what will be the next cycle? Menstruation, bleeding cycle, bleeding phase. So menstruation will start again, which will be the first phase. So this will be the second cycle, next cycle you can say. So next cycle will start. If there is no fertilization, corpus luteum will again degenerate. And if it will degenerate, so there will be no secretion of progesterone and estrogen. And what will happen? If there is no progesterone and estrogen, endometrium thickening will not be maintained. It will again become thin, and then shedding of the endometrium will take place during the menstruation phase, and there will be bleeding from the vagina. So endometrium is thickest during the luteal phase, and endometrium is thinnest during the which phase? During the menstrual phase. Clear? Now let's talk about the major events of the menstrual cycle, including the ovarian hormones. Let's focus on the ovarian hormones now. What is the level of the ovarian hormones? Clear? Now again, first phase is the menstruation phase, which occurs for day 1 to 5. Now here what happens? The estrogen and the progesterone level are low during this phase because the corpus luteum has obviously degenerated because there was no fertilization. If the corpus luteum degenerates, then the level of estrogen and progesterone will be very low because corpus luteum secretes these two hormones. Clear? So here what will happen? Endometrium will be very thin. So shedding of the endometrium will take place. Next is the follicular phase. So what happens? There is a rise in the estrogen levels. So this estrogen is secreted by the follicles. Clear? And there is a peak estrogen level just before the ovulation. So the estrogen level is at the maximum just before the ovulation. Means just before the 14th day. Clear? So here you can write endometrium will be thinnest, and there will be the breakdown or shedding of the endometrium leading to bleeding. Alright, then third is the ovulation, where the release of the ovum takes place. So this takes place around the 14 days. Here again there is a peak estrogen just before the ovulation, and there is the release of the ovum. And we have studied luteinizing hormone. There is a luteinizing hormone surge which leads to the release of the ovum. Now next phase is the luteal phase. So what is happening during the luteal phase? So this occurs from day 15 to day 28. So what happens here? There is a rise in the progesterone levels. Why? Because of the formation of the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum secretes the progesterone hormone and some amount of estrogen also. So there is a peak progesterone during the luteal phase. Means the progesterone level is at maximum during the luteal phase. Alright. Now what happens? If there is no fertilization, then corpus luteum will degenerate, and if the corpus luteum will degenerate, then there will be the decline in the progesterone and the estrogen level if fertilization doesn't occur. And then the next cycle will start. Okay. So this will be the first step again. Again the menstruation will start. So there is a drop in the hormone levels, which is, what are the hormones? Hormones are estrogen and progesterone. So level of both these hormones will decline, and this will trigger the shedding of the endometrium because endometrium is thinnest during this phase. Now let's talk about the major event of the menstrual cycle, including the pituitary hormones. Let's talk about the pituitary hormones. What is the role of the pituitary hormones? So what are pituitary hormones? This follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So what happens? Again, first phase is the menstruation phase. So there is a drop in the follicle stimulating hormone as well as luteinizing hormone. So there is a drop in the estrogen and progesterone also because the corpus luteum has degenerated because there was no fertilization. So these trigger shedding of the endometrium lining, causing the bleeding or the menstruation. Second is the follicular phase. Now what happens during the follicular phase? The pituitary gland, which is the endocrine gland, this secretes the or releases the follicle stimulating hormone. This follicle stimulating hormone, it stimulates the ovarian follicle growth. So I've already told you the primary follicle gets transformed into the mature follicle, which is known as the Graafian follicle. So what is FSH? FSH, this is the follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, and what does it do? It transforms the primary follicle. So what happens? There is a maturation of the follicle. So the primary follicle, it gets transformed into the mature follicle, or you can say Graafian follicle. Okay, so the growing follicles, they produce the estrogen, which helps in the thickening of the endometrium. Next, third phase is the ovulation phase. So what happens? There is a surge in the LH and it triggers the ovulation. So LH surge, it triggers the release of the ovum, and LH surge, it transforms follicle into the corpus luteum. Clear? So the follicle, Graafian follicle, it ruptures and there is a release of the ovule during the ovulation, and the remaining, you can say the structure, it gets transformed into the corpus luteum. So corpus luteum is basically formed in the luteal phase. Clear? That's why based on this corpus luteum, the name is given luteal phase, because here there is the formation of the corpus luteum. Now corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine gland and it secretes progesterone and some estrogen, and progesterone, you know, helps to maintain the endometrium lining. Okay, clear? So this is an image. This is showing you the major events during the menstruation cycle. Clear? So here you can see these are the uterine events. So what are the phases of the menstruation cycle? First is the menstruation or the bleeding phase. Next is the follicular phase, also known as the proliferative phase. Then you have the luteal phase, and on the 14th day you have the ovulation. Clear? So this is the ovulation. Which is at around 14 days after ovulation, you have the luteal phase, and then the next cycle begins. Clear? So what is happening during the uterine? What is happening to the uterine lining? You can see during the bleeding phase, the endometrium is the thinnest. Endometrium is quite thin, and during the follicular phase, because of the release of the estrogen, so you can see the estrogen level is quite high, and the maximum estrogen is present just before the ovulation. You can see here. So as the estrogen level rises, and what structure secretes this estrogen? The follicles. The follicles, these are the follicles, the mature follicles. These secretes the estrogen. So there is a release, there is an increase in the estrogen level. Okay, and this estrogen helps in the thickening of the endometrium. Then during the luteal phase, as the progesterone is secreted, so the thickening of the endometrium is the thickest. So here you will have the thickest endometrium. Clear? If you talk about the ovarian hormone levels, you can see the maximum level of estrogen is just before the ovulation. Here is the progesterone. Progesterone level will be obviously maximum during the luteal phase. Okay, clear? And then if we talk about the ovarian events, so here you have the developing follicle during the menstruation phase. Then during the follicle phase, what happens? These follicles, this gets transformed into the mature follicle. And then this mature follicle, which is known as the Graafian follicle, this ruptures. You can see this is showing you the rupture. There is a rupture and there is a release of the ovum. Alright. And the leftover, the structure after the release of the ovum, this is transformed into the corpus luteum. Clear? And if there is no fertilization, then there is the regression of the corpus luteum. Here, regression of the corpus luteum is, you can say, degradation of the corpus luteum. And if corpus luteum is not present, then again the level of estrogen as well as progesterone will decrease. Okay, if you talk about the pituitary hormones, which are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. So you can see the level of both FSH and LH. The maximum level is present just before the ovulation. Okay, so there is LH surge. In this LH surge, it helps in the release of the ovum, follicle stimulating hormone. So this helps in the maturation of the follicle. Clear? Then what happens after the ovulation? The level of both FSH and luteinizing hormone decreases. Clear? So these are the major events of the menstruation cycle. Now, alright, now we know about what is happening during the menstruation cycle. We know about the steps of the menstruation cycle. So what are the steps? First step is the menstruation phase. First stage is the menstruation phase, also known as the bleeding phase. The second is what? Second is the follicular phase, in which there is a development of the follicular. Follicular phase is also known as proliferative phase. Okay, then third is the ovulation, where there is a release of the ovum. And then fourth is the luteal phase. Okay, so these are the stages. Of the menstrual cycle. So you should know what is happening to the endometrium here, what is happening to the ovarian hormones, what is happening to the pituitary hormones, what is happening to the follicles. Then you can make a chart and you can talk about the endometrium thickening during these stages, and then you can talk about the level of the ovarian hormones. Then you can talk about the level of the pituitary hormones. And then you can talk about what? So we have endometrium, ovarian hormones, pituitary hormones, and then you can talk about the follicles. What is the condition of the follicles? Clear? Now, the menstruation cycle starts with the menstrual phase. So this is the first phase when menstrual flow occurs, and it lasts for 3 to 5 days. So this menstruation stage, this lasts for 3 to 5 days. Okay, although it was 1 to 5 days, but the bleeding occurs for 3 to 5 days. Now the menstrual flow results due to the breakdown of the endometrial lining. This we already know. So the endometrium becomes very thin during the menstruation phase because there is a decrease in the level of the estrogen as well as the progesterone due to the breakdown of the corpus luteum in the previous cycle, because there was no fertilization. Okay, so this bleeding occurs due to the breakdown or the shedding of the endometrium lining of the uterus as well as its blood vessels, which form liquid that comes through the vagina. Okay. Now, menstruation only occurs if the released ovum is not fertilized. Menstruation, we have seen, it occurs if the ovum is not fertilized. If the ovum is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum will degenerate. If the corpus luteum will degenerate, then there will be no release of the progesterone and estrogen, and both of these hormones are required for the maintenance of the endometrium. Clear? Now, lack of menstruation may be indicative of the pregnancy also. So during the pregnancy, there is no menstruation. Clear? However, it may also be caused due to some other underlying causes like stress and poor health. So this can also lead to the some changes in the menstrual cycle or stoppage of the menstrual cycle. Now, the menstrual phase is followed by the follicular phase. So, second phase is the follicular phase. So, during this phase, what happens? The primary follicles in the ovary, they grow to become a fully mature Graafian follicle. So, the primary follicle get transformed into the Graafian follicle, and simultaneously the endometrium of the uterus regenerates through the proliferation. Clear? So during the follicular phase, what happens? There is the primary follicles matures into the mature Graafian follicles, and these follicles, they secrete the estrogen, which helps in the maintenance of the endometrium. Now, these changes in the ovary and the uterus are induced by changes in the level of the pituitary and the ovarian hormones. So, the changes in the endometrium is caused due to the changes in the pituitary hormones as well as the ovarian hormones. So, pituitary hormones are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and ovarian hormones are what? What are ovarian hormones? Estrogen and progesterone. Okay, now the secretion of the gonadotrophins. What are gonadotrophins? Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. These increases gradually during the follicular phase. Okay, so follicles, they secrete the estrogen and the gonadotrophins, which are released by the pituitary. These are also, the level of these hormones also increase. And you have seen in the image that the follicle stimulating hormone and the level of luteinizing hormone, this is maximum just before the ovulation. So the follicular stimulating hormone, this will stimulate the follicular development during the follicular phase. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormones released during the follicular phase. And what happens? We already know both LH and FSH, they attain a peak level in the middle of the cycle, which is about 14 days. Follicle stimulating hormone is involved in the development of the follicles, and luteinizing hormone, this is involved, okay, in what? In the release of the ovum. In the release of the ovum. Now, rapid secretion of the luteinizing hormone leading to its maximum level during the mid-cycle, called LH surge, induces rupture of the Graafian follicles, and thereby there is the release of the ovum, which is known as ovulation. So there is LH surge, which leads to the ovulation. Clear? You can see there is LH surge just before the ovulation. Follicle stimulating hormone is also very high during the follicular phase. Now the ovulation, also known as the ovulatory phase. So third phase is the ovulatory phase. So this is followed by the luteal phase. Luteal phase is the fourth stage. Okay, during the luteal phase, what happens? There is the formation of the corpus luteum. Okay, this is the luteal phase, and this corpus luteum, it acts as a temporary endocrine gland. And what happens? How the corpus luteum develops? By the rupture of the Graafian follicles. So rupture of the Graafian follicle, it releases the egg or the ovum, and the remaining part of the Graafian follicle, it gets transformed into the corpus luteum, which secretes the hormone progesterone in high amount, and it also secretes some estrogen. Clear? Now, the corpus luteum during the luteal phase, it secretes large amount of progesterone, which is essential for maintenance of the endometrium. Now, such an endometrium is necessary for implantation of the fertilized ovum and other events of the pregnancy. Clear? So, why the endometrium thickens? Because it is preparing itself for the implantation. What is implantation? The attachment of the blastocyst to the uterine wall. This is known as the implantation. So after fertilization, what happens? There is the implantation. Clear? Now during pregnancy, all events of the menstrual cycle stop and there is no menstruation. Clear? So So this is the indicator. This can be the indicator of the pregnancy also, because the menstruation cycle stop during the pregnancy. Okay, it can also stop. Menstruation cycle can also stop due to the stress as well as due to the bad eating habits. So there can be deviations in this menstruation cycle. Now what happens in the absence of the fertilization, when the male and the female gamete, they do not fuse with each other, then what happens? The corpus luteum will degenerate. So it will degenerate and the level of estrogen and progesterone will be again become low, and then the next cycle will start. Now this causes the degradation of the endometrium, leading to the menstruation, marking a new cycle. In human beings, menstrual cycle ceases around 50 years of age. Now that is termed as the menopause. So one was the menarche, which is the onset of the menstruation during the puberty, and another one is the menopause. So what is menopause? Menopause is the stoppage, or the when the menstrual cycle ceases, or the stoppage of the menstrual cycle, which occurs in the human females at around 50 years of the age. So this is known as the menopause. Now the cyclic menstruation is an indicative of normal reproductive phase and extent between the menarche and the menopause. Clear? So reproductive phase is till when? From the menarche, means from the onset of the menstruation cycle to the end of the or the stoppage of the menstrual cycle. So both have been given the terms. Menarche for the onset of the menstruation cycle as the female individual achieves the puberty, and menopause is the stoppage of the menstruation cycle. Clear? So the release of ovum, it takes place at around 50 years only, but the formation of sperms, it can take place in the old male also. Clear? So in this session, we have talked about the menstruation cycle. We have talked about the definition of the menstruation cycle. How can we define it? Okay, so there is a lot of physical, physiological as well as hormonal changes, and menstruation cycle occurs after the female individual, it attains puberty. So at puberty, what happens? There is the activation of, you can say, the primary sex organ. Primary sex organ in female is ovaries. And ovaries, what is the function of ovaries? It secretes the hormone, estrogen as well as the progesterone, and it also helps in the development of the ovum. It also helps in the formation of the ovum. All right. And then we also talked about the stages of the or different phases of the menstruation cycle. Clear? So what was the first phase? Menstruation phase, also known as the bleeding phase. So in this phase, what happens? The endometrium is very thin, and there is the shedding of this endometrium, leading to the bleeding from the vagina. Then second phase is the follicular phase, also known as the proliferative phase. During this phase, what happens? There is the maturation of the primary follicle into the Graafian follicle, and there is the increase in the follicle stimulating hormone also, which is released from the pituitary. So follicle stimulating hormone, it helps in the transformation of the primary follicle into the mature Graafian follicle. Okay, and then what happens? There is a release of estrogen also during this phase. So this follicle, they secrete the estrogen, and estrogen helps to maintain the thickening of the endometrium. So endometrium starts to thicken during the follicular phase. Then what happens? This Graafian follicle, this will rupture, and there will be the release of the ovum, and this is known as the ovulatory phase. And what happens then? After the rupture of the Graafian follicle, the remaining part of the Graafian follicle, this will mature into the corpus luteum. Okay, and formation of the corpus luteum marks the beginning of the luteal phase. Then corpus luteum is what? This is the temporary endocrine gland, and it secretes hormones. Okay, basically it secretes the hormone progesterone, but it also secretes some amount of estrogen, and this progesterone is involved in the maintenance of the endometrium. Clear? And if there is no fertilization, the corpus luteum will degenerate, and there will be the decrease in the level of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and the endometrium, again, it will become thin, and there will be the shedding of the endometrium, and this initiates the next cycle. Okay, so rest of the topics we'll study in the next lecture. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you very much for listening.